G'day once again, so soon, from the Aussie Ideas Man. I was going to take a break, but too many things that just need knocking over. I'll do the same thing as I did last time, and that's use a lot of text boxes so that I don't have to bother you with my Aussie accent, because it seems to me you're getting a lot of accents lately.
My name is Brian APTERA It. I'm the chassis lead.
I'm Nathan Engler, lead of the Chassis and Suspension Zone. Today we'll be showcasing some of our engineering presentation, which will go over technical information that we share when presenting to investors. We'll be reviewing chassis, suspension, and some of our crash simulations. Enjoy!
So Nathan Engler is heading up our chassis and suspension team. This team is responsible for developing the chassis and obviously our suspension system, and also going to morph into this new role of leading our validation, homologation, and testing team in the next few months.
It's a really interesting point. You know, maybe a different company or a larger company would have a team, a chassis team that's constantly creating new chassis for new vehicles. But we're laser focused on this vehicle right now. So he's able to take his team, because they have done this kind of validation work in the past, and transform them into the validation and testing team. He's able to take his team, because they have done this kind of validation work in the past, and transform them into the validation and testing team. He's able to take his team, because they have done this kind of validation work in the past, and transform them into the validation and testing team.
This is a good rendering of the current status of the structural battery frame.
I think one of the big things that happened when we started talking with CPC and ETP is they said create a load path from the front suspension to the rear, and everything gets a lot easier.
Yes, and we will see that in the next few slides. But this architecture also allows us again to go back to the famous 12 minutes cycle time. We can build this frame with the suspension components on a sub-assembly line, and then marry it with the bink at a later point in the assembly line. This is the front end of the vehicle, again very modular. It's an unequal A-arm setup. We brought the shocks and suspension components to the center of the vehicle, centralizing the center of gravity into the nose of the vehicle. We brought the shocks and suspension components to the center of the vehicle, centralizing the center of gravity into the nose of the vehicle. We brought the shocks and suspension components to the center of the vehicle, centralizing the center of gravity into the nose of the vehicle. And again, as we said, it's a modular setup. So I think Sandy Monroe is in love with the idea of creating sub-assembly lines where you can put components together. This whole front end can be put together in one station, and then installed into the frame, and then into the vehicle at a later time. And we can allows us to play with the location of the assembly lines.
Right. When this sub-assembly is presented to the line doesn't care if it's made in, you know, whatever state or whatever country, even. So that gives us the flexibility to make these wherever it makes sense.
Yep.
But then it's just a simple attachment to the vehicle.
And that fits really well into Pablo's plan of world domination. He really wants to build APTERAs in every corner of the world, and this type of approach allows us to do that. It also reduces the costs and the risks, and later on quality problems. This is the rear suspension architecture.
All the other three-wheelers out there have single-sided swing arms. The problem is that as that swing arm moves in the rear, the tire actually gets closer and further away from the front suspension as you accelerate and decelerate, and it gives you some interesting, odd suspension characteristics that you kind of feel when you're driving. But this four-link suspension lets the rear wheel float very predictably up and down evenly with the front suspension, so you don't feel it when you're stopping or accelerating. It feels just like any other kind of four-wheel vehicle you drive.
Yeah, the single-sided swing arm or a long swing arm works really well for a motorcycle that has a different geometry, different CG than we do. This setup is ideal for our architecture.
And patented.
Patented, yes. As we said earlier, and we will show you in a little bit, actually next slide, we have done a lot of computer analysis on the structure to increase the level of safety, and also to predict how the vehicle is going to behave once we are in production. And that this type of analysis allows us to not only to make it safer, but also speed up the development process. Switching to the structural battery frame idea architecture allows us to drive the forces, the energy in an impact, like a frontal impact or a side impact, corner impact, underneath the drivers and the passenger instead of into the actual structure. Not only makes it safer, it also makes it easier to repair, easier to service later on in the field.
And even though you get increased vehicle torsional rigidity from the structural battery pack, it still allows the impact forces to go past the battery pack.
Important to note that the heaviest mass item of the vehicle is the battery, right? So try to put all the impact loads into the highest mass item, and that's exactly what this does. So I love it.
And the other thing is these obviously modern tools that allow us to analyze it. We know how aluminum works, right. So it's makes it very, very predictable, and reduces the risk of tooling something up. So we can eliminate some intermediate steps in the development of this whole entire project because we can predict how these components are going to behave.
That's a really good point. We can make a small change in software and have a high degree of confidence that it's going to behave that way in the real world.
And this chart shows the red line is the simulation, and the blue lines are when we actually went out and got real-world data. This is our suspension test jig. Our engineers were considering what wires to use to go to the in-wheel motor out on the wheel and what cooling tubes to use and how they would stand up over time. And the only way to really understand it is to test it. So this guy's been running for a couple months and already has 200,000 plus miles of durability on it. But it goes up and down and it turns the wheel and it shows you how those cables and hoses are going to rub over time.
And it was really helpful because a lot of our assumptions about how to fix the cables and hoses or not to, how they would be captured or allowed to slide. Some of those concepts were jettisoned and some of those were reaffirmed. And so we were able to learn that early on with this and have a high degree of confidence so we can get, many, many miles durability out of those systems.
This is a good example of some of the areas that there's no historical data for it. So there's nobody out there doing the same thing, so right. We couldn't just go back and say, hey, what did some other OEM do in this situation? This is our own unique setup, and we are learning as we are doing it.
To view the unedited presentation, please join our accelerator program at invest.aptera.us.
That's all from me. Bye for now, and stay safe.